Hello there, Johannes of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. Today we're going to Ireland again for another single pot still whiskey. This one from a historic brand, Powers. And Powers, date established, 1791. And this is Three Swallow single pot still whiskey. Now, what makes this different from John's Lane is that John's Lane from Powers is a 12-year-old whiskey. This is a whiskey that's probably going to be more in your 5 to 7 year range, I guess. And this is a range of age that I'm really interested in, because my thing with Redbreast is that I think it's in the cask a little bit too long. I know people love Redbreast. I am not particularly a huge fan of Redbreast. I never could quite get it. And I think it's the time in the barrel that maybe does that. I've never owned a bottle of Redbreast. I've always tasted somebody else's. And so in that kind of rushed atmosphere, maybe I'm not giving it its just dues. I've never had the cask strength version, so I can't really tell you on that either. But this comes out of the exact same distillery. So maybe they're using different recipes. Maybe one is using more unmalted barley, maybe the other one's using less unmalted barley. Hard to say. Old pot still is a mixture of malted and unmalted barley, so you know. We're looking for honey, grain, pepper. Those are going to be some of the primary flavors that we're probably going to jump across. And so this, and Powers is a name that's been around, as I say, 1791, and that's when John Power decided to open up a distillery in his pub. Good idea in Dublin. Yeah, why not? I mean, people are hanging around drinking beer. Why not make your own whiskey? So that is what happens. And Powers actually became maybe the first distillery in Ireland to bottle their own whiskey. It's kind of an interesting history, because a lot of those distillers, Jameson, Powers, Rowe, they didn't actually bottle their own whiskey. They gave barrels to what they call bonders, call them rectifiers here in the U.S., and they would basically, put the packaging together to send out to their customers or make available to their customers. And so when you look through the history of Irish whiskey, you find an interesting situation where a lot of the brands that were out there would say the name of the bonder with the name of the distiller is kind of a secondary thought. And so that's where you start picking up some of these really obscure names, and you're like, oh, Mitchell, what is that? Where does that come from? And this is where we're talking about the bonders in Ireland. And that left open a lot of opportunity for chicanery, where maybe the whiskey was good enough, maybe it wasn't. And the distiller didn't really have any control over it, because once they gave the barrel over to the bonder, it's up to the bonder. So Powers decided that they would come out with something called Gold Label, smaller bottles with their own distillate, their own whiskey, put into the bottle, not necessarily to sell to you because they wanted to be the company selling you. They wanted to have these bonders do that work for them. Let us do what we do well, you do what you do well, kind of a thing. But there was a real question coming up as to whether the bonders were actually putting out good quality stuff, or maybe they were watering it down too much. There were questions in people's minds. And so to solve that issue, Powers came out with mini bottles that they called Gold Label, and that was so you could buy one of those, taste it versus your own bottle that you got from the bonder, and see if it was legit or if they were maybe tampering with it and diluting it or making it not as good as it could have been. So interesting story behind Powers. my thing is that when I first opened this bottle, I will tell you, see where it's at. I opened this bottle a week ago. I bought this a week ago, and I'm already that far through it. Now I am not. I know I do a whiskey channel, but I don't. And I'm doing tastings and all that sort of stuff. But I actually am not a huge whiskey drinker. I mean, I don't really just get into a bottle and start working it down. It usually sits on the shelf, and I just take little bits out of it. And what's curious about this is that I did my initial review on this, and after I did the review, I got into a conversation with my brother on the phone, and I was sipping bits of this while I was talking with him, and it was so enjoyable to drink. And my review of this whiskey was not as kind as the experience that I had after I did the review. The thing that I was running into when I first did this tasting, and I just threw that video away because I just don't think it's relevant anymore. But when I did that video, I was specifically grading this on how it met my expectations for a pot still whiskey. And I gave it a good review, but I didn't say it was very good or excellent. I was just like, it's good. I think it could be better. Then I had the experience of sipping some. Then after that conversation, I went back the next day. I'm like, I really enjoyed that. Let me pour another glass of it. And watching the movie and poured another glass of it. And lo and behold, I'm halfway through this bottle of Powers that I thought at first was, slightly disappointing for my expectation. But now going to dive back in, clear head, and just going to see what we come up with in terms of what is it that all of a sudden drew me into this whiskey. 43.2% ABV. So some of us would say, yeah, it'd be nice if it was a little bit higher in ABV, but man, on the nose is the grain that I long for in a single pot still whiskey. It is. It's on the. It has a bit of graham cracker, probably more on the honey side. There's a little bit of a tropical fruit note in this actually too. It's not an overly strong nose in terms of it doesn't jump out and pop in your face. You do have to kind of go after it a little bit. But I'm trying to see if there's any other, because this is aged only in bourbon barrels, and I'm trying to see if there's any real bourbon barrel influence on this. Now, when I did the busker the other day, the barrels were really impactful on the flavor of that whiskey. But this, it's very light. Cheers. Trying to think how to put this into words. I understand why I was disappointed in it. I was disappointed in it because there's no flavor that really stands out on this whiskey when you put it on your palate. There's a nice little bit of oiliness, but it's just like a hint of oiliness. There's the grain note, but it's not overbearing. There's a lemon note, but it's not overbearing. The pepper does heat your tongue, but it's a pleasant experience. Again, it does not go down your throat. It is all on your tongue. Leaves a little heat, maybe a little grapefruit note there. Maybe I get a little bit of char from the barrel. It's not as toffee forward as the busker was. But the thing about this whiskey is that, I know I'm going to shoot myself for saying this, it's smooth. I tell people, don't use that word, don't use that word. The reason why this was so easy for me to just sit there and be in a conversation and drink on it is because while it's not overly oily, it has oily presence to it, so it's got a nice mouthfeel to it. It has that nice grain note in it. The more you drink of it, the more the pepper kind of dissipates, and it just becomes a really nice, comfortable drinking whiskey that keeps inviting you to pour another glass and enjoy some more of it. And so I don't think this is a whiskey that is going to set the world on fire. But I do think that this is a whiskey that is so nice to drink that you just drink it. So this is not going to be a whiskey that I'm going to say in this kind of a atmosphere where I'm trying to tell you tasting notes that I'm going to give you a whole lot to run with, because everything is kind of subtle. But in a way, that nice mouthfeel that comes in on this drinking experience, and the fact that there are no real off-putting notes in this whiskey. It's just a nice, even-handed, really well-crafted whiskey. My opinion on this has changed. I would say this is a very good whiskey. Very good for the purpose, which is I am looking for a whiskey that I'm having a conversation with friends, and I just want to have a really nice drinking whiskey that just enhances the entire experience and makes me say, I'm glad I drank that whiskey on that particular night, because I'm impressed by it. I still am on the lookout for that particular style of pot still whiskey that is going to have more grain note to it and is going to have more oiliness to it. But honestly, there's one thing, if there's one minor drawback for me, is there's this one tasting note on the finish that I'm not picking up so much now, and after you've had a couple of sips of it, it kind of goes away, is there's this Pabst Blue Ribbon beer note at the end. Call it a oily barley note, oily burnt barley. Because that's what I sort of think of when I think of, beyond the carbonation of American beers, it's kind of what I think of when I think of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. And so there is a little bit of that on the end, but after you've been sipping it for a while, and if you're in a conversation, you really don't pay attention to it anymore. And as my brother said, he likes Pabst Blue Ribbon, so he probably would like this whiskey from that standpoint. So there you go. But I like it. Honestly, I was saying when I first sipped this, I wouldn't spend $44 on this, spend the 30 and get the busker, and I think you'll be happier. But honestly, this may become a regular part of my cabinet, mainly for the purpose of when I'm just in the mood to drink something that I don't have to pay a ton of attention to, but I just want a really pleasant experience out of it. 3 swallows, man. This stuff is really, really interesting. Hope you enjoyed the video. Give me a like if you will. That helps support the channel and gets other people to be able to find these videos as well. Love sharing the information as much as possible, and subscribe if you want more videos down the road. Until next time, cheers and Slainte. That Pabst Blue Ribbon is still there. Ooh, grapefruit. Very interesting.